My name is Alina, and today I want to share with you what happened on my 70th birthday. It's a story about family, betrayal, and the dangerous game of underestimating someone who has lived 7 decades on this earth. You know, when you reach 70, you start to think about legacy. Not just the money you leave behind, but the values you've instilled, the love you've given, the sacrifices you've made. I thought my children understood that. I was wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened on my 70th birthday, you need to know who I am and what I've been through. 47 years ago, I married Harold. We were both young, full of dreams, and desperately in love. Harold had big ambitions but came from nothing. I came from a family with some means. My father owned a small chain of hardware stores, nothing fancy but stable. When we got married, my father offered Harold a position in the business. But Harold had pride, you see. He wanted to make his own way. So instead, we used my small inheritance, $15,000, which was significant money in 1976, to start Harold's construction company. Those early years were hard. I worked as a secretary during the day and did the books for Harold's company at night. When Robert was born in 1978, I quit my job to raise him. 2 years later came Susan. I became a full-time mother while Harold built the business, one contract at a time. I remember those nights when Harold would come home covered in dust and cement, exhausted but determined. I would have dinner waiting, the kids bathed and ready for bed, and after they slept, we'd sit at the kitchen table planning the future. Every penny was reinvested into the company. Every decision was made together. By the time the kids were in elementary school, Harold's company was doing well. We bought our first real house in 1985, a modest 4-bedroom colonial on Elm Street. Nothing extravagant, but it had a big backyard where Robert could practice baseball and Susan could have her tea parties. But success in construction meant Harold was away more often. Bigger contracts meant longer hours, sometimes weeks on job sites in other cities. So I became mother and father to our children. I drove them to every practice, every recital, every game. I helped with homework, attended parent-teacher conferences, nursed them through every childhood illness. When Robert broke his arm in 6th grade, Harold was on a job site 3 hours away. I spent 12 hours in the emergency room alone with a screaming 11-year-old, then 3 weeks managing his care while he recovered. When Susan had pneumonia her freshman year of high school, Harold was bidding on a major commercial project. Again, it was just me, sleeping in a chair by her hospital bed for 4 nights straight. I'm not telling you this to complain. I'm telling you this so you understand. I gave everything to my family. My career, my personal dreams, my youth, all of it went into raising Robert and Susan and supporting Harold's ambitions. By the 1990s, Harold's company had grown beyond our wildest dreams. We were landing major municipal contracts, building schools and office complexes. The modest construction company had become Morrison and Associates, with 37 employees and annual revenues in the millions. In 1994, we bought the house on Countryside Drive. 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a 3-car garage, and 2 acres of perfectly manicured lawn. It was our dream home, the symbol of everything we'd built together. Robert was in college then, studying business at State University. We paid every penny of his tuition, room and board, even gave him a generous allowance so he could focus on studies instead of working part-time like most of his classmates. Susan was a junior in high school, already talking about law school. Those were golden years. Harold and I would sit on our back porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over our property, talking about retirement, about grandchildren, about the legacy we were building. One day, Harold would say, "This will all be theirs. Everything we've worked for, everything we've built, it's all for Robert and Susan." I believed him. More than that, I believed in the family we'd created together. The first signs of trouble came after the kids graduated college. Robert joined the company immediately. Harold made him a junior partner within 2 years. Susan went to law school as planned, and we covered every expense, including the down payment on her first apartment. But something had changed in our children. The gratitude I expected, the appreciation for the sacrifices we'd made, it wasn't there. Instead, there was entitlement. Robert began questioning every decision Harold made in the company. He'd argue at family dinners about modernizing the business, about Harold being too conservative in his approach. Susan would roll her eyes when I'd mention the old days, the struggles we'd faced building what they now took for granted. "Mom, that was like forever ago," she'd say dismissively. "Things are different now." Different? Yes, things were very different. Robert married Jennifer in 2003. The wedding cost us $85,000, a lavish affair at the country club with 300 guests. I spent months planning every detail, wanting it to be perfect for my son. Jennifer barely thanked me, and when she did, it felt perfunctory. From the beginning, Jennifer made it clear she thought I was too involved in Robert's life. She'd make little comments. "Robert doesn't need his mommy making decisions for him anymore," or "I think it's time Robert started thinking for himself." Harold noticed too, but he was philosophical about it. She's protecting her territory, he'd say. All daughters-in-law go through this phase. But it wasn't a phase, it was the beginning of something much worse. After Robert and Jennifer's first child was born, my grandson Michael, the distance became more pronounced. They'd make plans for family gatherings and somehow forget to invite me. Or they'd invite me with such short notice that I couldn't attend, then act like my absence proved I wasn't interested in being a grandmother. "We had Michael's first birthday party last weekend," Jennifer would mention casually. "Too bad you couldn't make it." I hadn't even known about it. Susan wasn't much better. After she passed the bar exam, she joined a prestigious firm in the city. Suddenly, she was too busy for family dinners, too important for our small-town lifestyle. She'd visit maybe once a month, stay for an hour, and spend the entire time on her phone. Harold tried to bridge the gaps. He'd organize family vacations, big holiday celebrations, anything to bring us together. But even when the kids showed up physically, they weren't really there. Robert would spend the entire time talking business with Harold, treating family time like another board meeting. Susan would complain about everything, the food, the accommodations, even the weather. "I don't understand it," Harold confided in me one night. "We gave them everything. Why do they act like we're strangers?" I didn't have an answer then. I do now. In 2018, Harold started showing signs of early dementia. It began with small things: forgetting appointments, misplacing keys, repeating stories. As his wife of 42 years, I noticed immediately. Harold, proud as always, tried to hide it. I became his protector, his memory, his shield against a world that was becoming increasingly confusing to him. I managed his medications, drove him to appointments, handled more and more of the household responsibilities. It was exhausting, but it never occurred to me to do anything else. This was the man I'd loved for more than 4 decades, the father of my children. Of course I would care for him. Robert and Susan's response to their father's diagnosis was interesting. Suddenly, they were very concerned about the business, about Harold's capacity to make decisions, about protecting the family's interests. Robert pushed for power of attorney. Susan wanted Harold declared legally incompetent. They held meetings about managing Dad's assets that I was somehow never invited to. "Mom, you're too emotional about this," Susan told me. "You can't think clearly about what's best for Dad." Too emotional about my husband's health, about watching the man I loved slowly disappear. During Harold's decline, I discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I researched every treatment, consulted with specialists, created detailed care plans. I learned to manage complex medical equipment, coordinate with home health aides, handle insurance companies and Medicare paperwork. But to my children, I had become invisible. They saw only Harold's illness, not my competence in managing it. They saw only the problems, not my solutions. When Harold died in January 2020, I felt like I'd lost not just my husband, but my identity. For 44 years, I'd been half of a partnership. Now I was just Elena. After Harold's funeral, which my children somehow turned into a business networking event, I faced a new reality. I was 67 years old, alone for the first time in my adult life, and according to my children, completely helpless. "Mom, you can't possibly manage that big house by yourself," Robert said, "and the finances. Dad handled all of that. You probably don't even know what bank accounts you have." The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Susan agreed. "Mom, we're worried about you. Living alone in that huge house, trying to manage money and bills, it's too much for someone your age." Someone my age? As if turning 67 had suddenly erased my intelligence, my decades of experience managing a household and helping to build a multi-million-dollar business. They wanted me to sell the house immediately. "The market's hot right now," Robert explained. "You could get top dollar, then move somewhere more manageable." By manageable, they meant small, cheap, out of the way. But this house wasn't just real estate to me. It was where I'd raised my family, where Harold and I had shared our happiest moments, where 40 years of memories lived in every room. The thought of strangers walking through our bedroom, our kitchen, our garden, it felt like a betrayal of everything we'd built. So I said no. That's when things got really ugly. What I didn't realize at the time was that my refusal to immediately sell the house and downsize my life was seen by my children as evidence of declining mental capacity. They began what I can only describe as a systematic campaign to prove I was incompetent. They'd visit unannounced and critique everything. Jennifer would run her finger along surfaces checking for dust. Robert would inspect the yard and shake his head at weeds I hadn't noticed. Susan would go through my mail and question every purchase, every bill, every financial decision. "Mom, you spent $200 at the grocery store this week," she'd say, holding up receipts. "That's way too much for one person." Never mind that I was buying food to stock the kitchen for their visits, buying the steaks Robert liked, the expensive wine Susan preferred, the organic snacks Jennifer insisted were the only appropriate food for little Michael. They started making decisions about my life without consulting me. Robert arranged for a cleaning service because he said the house was getting beyond what Mom could handle. Susan hired a financial advisor to review Mom's situation because I was clearly in over my head. When I protested, they exchanged those looks. You know, the ones, the patient, condescending expressions adult children give when they think their parent is being difficult. "Mom, we're just trying to help," Robert would say. "We love you and we're worried," Susan would add. But their help felt like control, their worry felt like judgment. Gradually, I found myself excluded from decisions about my own life. The financial advisor Robert hired would send reports to Robert, not me. The cleaning service would arrive on days I hadn't agreed to, rearranging my home according to someone else's standards. My grandchildren, Robert's kids Michael and Emma, Susan's daughter Lucy, began visiting less and less. When I asked about them, I was told they were busy with school or going through a phase. Later, I learned the truth. Jennifer had been telling them that Grandma was getting old and confused, and that visits were stressful for everyone. She was preparing them for my inevitable decline, my eventual absence from their lives. The cruelest part was the financial control. Robert, as the family's golden boy, had somehow convinced everyone that I needed protection from my own spending. He began monitoring my bank accounts, questioning every purchase, treating me like a child with an allowance. "Mom, you bought new curtains for the living room. They cost $300. Don't you think that's excessive?" These were my curtains in my house, bought with money I'd helped earn over decades of marriage and sacrifice. But somehow I'd become accountable to my 45-year-old son for every financial decision. Susan supported this completely. "It's for your own good, Mom. We've seen what happens when elderly people lose track of their finances. We're protecting you from making mistakes. Mistakes like living in my own home, decorating it to my taste, spending my own money on things that brought me comfort." As my 70th birthday approached this past March, I found myself dreading what should have been a celebration. The last few birthdays had been painful affairs, obligatory visits, where my children went through the motions of celebration, while making it clear they'd rather be anywhere else. For my 68th birthday, Susan had given me a subscription to a meal delivery service because cooking for one person is so difficult. The meals were bland, portion-controlled things that tasted like cardboard. The message was clear. I was no longer capable of feeding myself properly. For my 69th birthday, Robert had given me a medical alert device. "In case you fall and can't get up," he'd explained cheerfully, as if my inevitable physical decline was already a foregone conclusion. So when they suggested a family celebration for my 70th, I should have been suspicious. But some foolish part of me hoped that maybe, for this milestone birthday, they would remember the mother who had given them everything, the woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to build theirs. I was wrong. March 15th, 2024. My 70th birthday, 7 decades on this earth, and this was how my children chose to mark it. They arrived at my house around noon. Robert, Jennifer, and their 2 kids. Susan and her daughter Lucy. Everyone was dressed nicely, carrying wrapped gifts, wearing bright smiles. For a moment I allowed myself to hope. "Happy birthday, Mom," they chorused as I opened the door. The lunch was pleasant enough. Jennifer had brought a beautiful cake from the expensive bakery downtown. The grandchildren gave me handmade cards that were genuinely sweet. We ate on the good china and conversation flowed easily. Then came the gifts. Susan went first. She handed me an elegantly wrapped box containing a digital photo frame. "We programmed it with all the family pictures," she said proudly. "This way you can see everyone even when we can't visit as often." Even when we can't visit as often. The gift came with a built-in excuse for future absence. Robert's children gave me a soft throw blanket and a book of large-print crossword puzzles. Thoughtful gifts, but the message was clear. Here are things for an elderly woman who spends her days sitting quietly, not making demands on anyone. Then Robert handed me his gift. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive stationery. For a moment I thought it might be something meaningful, perhaps a letter expressing gratitude for everything I'd done, or a family photo we could hang together. I opened it carefully, aware that everyone was watching me intently, their expressions expectant. Inside was a single sheet of paper and what looked like a plane ticket. I read the paper first. It was a brochure for Sunset Manor, an assisted living community about 3 hours away. The pictures showed smiling elderly people in wheelchairs playing bingo, being fed by uniformed staff. Then I looked at the plane ticket. One way, departure date April 1st, destination the city where Sunset Manor was located. I stared at these items for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Around the table, my family watched me expectantly, as if they'd just given me the most wonderful gift imaginable. "It's perfect, Mom," Robert said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "Sunset Manor has everything you need. 24-hour medical care, meals provided, activities planned. You won't have to worry about anything." Susan leaned forward eagerly. "We've already put down the deposit. Your room will be ready by April 1st. It's right next to the nurse's station, so you'll feel safe." Jennifer smiled brightly, and the best part is you won't have the stress of maintaining this big house anymore. We can handle selling it and managing all the paperwork. You can just relax and enjoy your retirement. Lucy, Susan's 16-year-old daughter, was the only one who looked uncomfortable. She was staring down at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes. I looked around the table at these people, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, people I had loved unconditionally, sacrificed for, built my entire life around. They were looking at me expectantly, waiting for gratitude, waiting for me to thank them for solving the problem of my existence, and I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a grateful smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally, completely understood something she'd been avoiding for years. My children didn't love me, they didn't respect me, they didn't see me as a person with rights, with feelings, with autonomy. They saw me as a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed from their lives. Well, Robert prompted, what do you think? I set the brochure and the plane ticket down carefully on the table, smoothing the edges with my fingers. Everyone leaned forward slightly, waiting for my response. I think, I said quietly, that this is very interesting. The smile never left my face. Interesting? Susan frowned. Mom, this is a wonderful opportunity. Sunset Manor has a waiting list a mile long. We had to call in favors just to get you in. I nodded thoughtfully. I'm sure you did, and I appreciate the thought you've put into this. Robert relaxed visibly. I knew you'd understand once you really thought about it. This house is just too much for you, Mom, and living alone at your age, it's not safe. Safety, I repeated. Yes, I can see how that would be a concern. Jennifer jumped in, her voice taking on that bright, false cheerfulness she used when she was trying to sell me on something. And think of all the friends you'll make. The activities coordinator told us they have book clubs and bridge games and even gardening clubs if you're interested. Gardening clubs, I said, how nice. The conversation continued around me as my family enthusiastically described all the wonderful aspects of institutional care. The provided meals meant I wouldn't have to worry about grocery shopping or cooking. The scheduled activities meant I'd never be bored. The medical staff meant I'd always have help if I needed it. They made it sound like paradise. Throughout this discussion, I kept smiling. I asked polite questions about visiting hours, about what I'd be allowed to bring with me, about how long the transition period usually took. Oh, the transition is usually pretty quick, Robert assured me. Most people adjust within the first month or two. And if they don't adjust, I asked mildly. Well, Susan said carefully, the staff there are trained to help people with difficult transitions. They have ways of making sure everyone settles in comfortably. Ways of making sure, how ominous that sounded. Lucy finally spoke up. Grandma, are you really okay with this? All eyes turned to her, and I saw Jennifer shoot her daughter a warning look. I mean, Lucy continued bravely, don't you love living in your house? Don't you want to stay where all your memories are? Out of the mouths of babes, my 16-year-old granddaughter understood something that had apparently escaped every adult at this table. Lucy raises an interesting point, I said. This house does hold a lot of memories. Your grandfather and I were very happy here. But Mom, Robert said impatiently, you can't live in the past forever. You have to be practical about the future. Practical about the future. From a man who had never had to be practical about anything in his life, whose every opportunity had been handed to him on a silver platter paid for by his parents' sacrifices. You're absolutely right, I said. Being practical is very important. And I meant it, just not in the way they thought. The birthday celebration ended shortly after the gift giving. My family seemed satisfied that I'd accepted their solution without making a fuss. They hugged me goodbye with what felt like relief. The difficult conversation was over, the problem was solved, and now they could get on with their lives. We'll help you pack, Susan promised, and we'll take care of all the arrangements for selling the house. You don't need to worry about any of it. How generous of them to handle the sale of my home, the disposal of my life's possessions, the erasure of my independence. After they left, I sat alone in my living room, looking at the plane ticket and the brochure for Sunset Manor. One-way ticket, departing April 1st, 2 weeks to wrap up my life and report for managed care. But as I sat there in the gathering dusk, I wasn't feeling the despair they probably expected. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: clarity. You see, my children had made a fundamental error in their calculations. They had assumed that because I was 70, because I was widowed, because I sometimes needed help opening stubborn jars, I was helpless. They had confused physical aging with mental decline, had mistaken my grief for incompetence, had interpreted my love for them as dependence on them. They were about to learn how wrong they were. What my children didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, never shown any interest in learning, was the true extent of what Harold and I had built together over our 44 years of marriage. Yes, they knew about the construction company. They knew Robert was a junior partner, and they assumed that represented the bulk of the family's wealth. They knew about the house on Countryside Drive, and they'd been salivating over its potential sale price for months. What they didn't know about were the investments. Harold might have been a small-town contractor to most people, but he was a brilliant businessman. Starting in the early 1980s, we began investing in real estate. Not flashy properties, not get-rich-quick schemes, but solid, practical investments that grew steadily over decades. We bought our first rental property in 1983, a modest duplex near the university. The rental income covered the mortgage, and by 1990 we owned it free and clear. We used the equity to buy 2 more properties, then 4, then 8. By the time Harold died, we owned 17 rental properties across 3 counties. Not mansions, not luxury condos, but solid, well-maintained homes that provided steady income and had appreciated substantially over the decades. But that wasn't all. In 1995, Harold's company was hired to do the groundwork for a new shopping center being built on the outskirts of town. The developer was short on capital, so Harold proposed a partnership. We'd do the work at cost in exchange for a 30% ownership stake in the center. That shopping center now generates over $200,000 in annual revenue. Our share is $60,000 every year just for making one smart decision 28 years ago. Then there were the stocks. Harold was conservative with most investments, but he had a gift for spotting undervalued companies. In 1998, he bought $50,000 worth of stock in a small tech company that most people thought was overvalued. That company was Amazon, need I say more? We also owned timber land in 3 states, mineral rights in Colorado, and a small stake in a wind farm in Texas. When Harold died, our total assets were worth just over $4.7 million. But here's the part my children really didn't understand. Harold had insisted on putting everything in both our names, every property, every investment, every bank account. We built this together, he'd always said. It belongs to both of us. So when Harold passed away, I didn't inherit his wealth. I retained ownership of wealth we'd accumulated together, wealth that had been legally mine all along. My children saw a widow who needed help managing her finances. The reality was that I was a 70-year-old woman with a diversified investment portfolio worth nearly $5 million, generating enough passive income to live comfortably for the rest of my life without touching the principal. But they never asked about the details of our finances. They just assumed that Dad handled everything, and now helpless Mom would need their guidance to avoid making terrible mistakes. The morning after my birthday, I began making phone calls. My first call was to Margaret Henley, my attorney. Margaret and I had known each other for 15 years. She'd handled the legal work for several of our property purchases, and she'd helped us set up our wills and trusts. "Alina," she greeted me warmly, "how was your birthday celebration?" "Illuminating," I said. "Margaret, I need to see you today if possible. There are some changes I need to make to my estate planning." "Of course. Can you come in around 2 p.m.? My second call was to James Peterson, our financial advisor. James had been managing our investments for nearly a decade, and he'd been sending me monthly reports since Harold's death, reports that my children apparently assumed I was too addled to understand. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," James said. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing very well, James. I need to schedule a meeting to discuss some portfolio adjustments." "Certainly. Is there anything specific you want to review?" "Actually, yes. I want to discuss liquidating some assets and making some strategic changes to the beneficiaries on several accounts." There was a pause. James knew exactly what that meant. "I see. How soon do you want to meet?" "This afternoon after I see Margaret, say 4 p.m. My third call was to David Walsh at Countryside Realty. David had been begging me to list the house for months. Apparently, large properties in established neighborhoods were in high demand. "Mrs. Morrison, what a pleasant surprise. Are you finally ready to talk about listing the house?" "Actually, David, I've been thinking about it more seriously. Could you come by tomorrow morning to discuss pricing and timeline?" "Absolutely. I have to tell you, in this market, a property like yours, you're going to be very happy with the numbers." I was sure I would be. My final call was to Sunset Manor. "Good morning," I said when the receptionist answered. "I'm calling about a reservation that was made for me. Alina Morrison, room deposit paid by Robert Morrison." "Oh yes, Mrs. Morrison, we're so excited to welcome you next month. Do you have any questions about your arrival?" "Actually, I'm calling to cancel the reservation." "Cancel? Oh my, is there a problem with the room assignment? We could certainly." "No, the room assignment is fine. I've simply decided not to move in. Please refund the deposit to whoever paid it." "But, Mrs. Morrison, your son explained that this was for your own well-being, that you really needed our level of care." "My son was mistaken about what I need," I said politely. "Please cancel the reservation." After I hung up, I sat in Harold's old chair in the living room, looking out at the garden we'd planted together 40 years ago. The tulips were just beginning to emerge, Harold's favorite flowers, the first sign of spring after each long winter. I had 2 weeks to set everything in motion, 2 weeks to teach my children a lesson they would never forget. Margaret's law office was downtown, in a converted Victorian house that she'd bought and renovated herself. She was about my age, a sharp-eyed woman who'd built her practice from nothing after her own divorce 20 years earlier. "So," she said once I was seated in her office, "tell me what's going on." I told her about the birthday celebration, about the plane ticket and the nursing home brochure, about my children's systematic campaign to convince me I was incompetent. Margaret listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. "Elena, in my professional opinion, you are one of the most competent clients I have. Your understanding of your financial situation is excellent, your decision-making is sound, and your memory is better than most people half your age." "Thank you, I was hoping you'd say that because I want to make some significant changes to my will and my trust." "What kind of changes?" I opened my purse and pulled out a handwritten list I'd prepared. "I want to remove Robert and Susan as beneficiaries of my estate. I want to remove them as trustees of the family trust, and I want to establish new beneficiaries for everything." Margaret raised her eyebrows. "That's quite comprehensive. Are you sure about this?" "Margaret, my children just gave me a one-way ticket to a nursing home for my 70th birthday. They're planning to sell my house without my permission and use the money to pay for institutional care I don't need or want. They've spent 2 years treating me like I'm mentally incompetent, I'm sure." "All right then, who do you want as your new beneficiaries?" I smiled. "My grandchildren, but not directly. I want to set up educational trusts for Michael, Emma, and Lucy. Full college tuition, graduate school if they want it, plus living expenses. But the money goes directly to educational institutions, not to their parents." "That's interesting. What about the rest of your estate?" "I want to establish a foundation. The Elena and Harold Morrison Foundation, dedicated to helping elderly people who are being mistreated by their families. Legal aid, alternative housing, financial protection, whatever they need to maintain their independence and dignity." Margaret was taking notes rapidly. "This is a substantial estate, Elena. You're talking about disinheriting your children completely." "Not completely. I'm leaving them each exactly $1, with a note explaining that this represents the value they placed on my love, my sacrifice, and my dignity." "And you're certain about this?" I thought about the plane ticket sitting on my kitchen table, about the casual way my children had decided my fate without consulting me, about the years of condescension and control. "Margaret, I have never been more certain of anything in my life." James Peterson's office was in the financial district, modern and sleek, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. James had been managing our investments since 2013, and in that time he'd helped grow our portfolio by nearly 40%. "Elena, you look wonderful," he said as I settled into the chair across from his desk. "I have to ask, how are you managing? I know these first few years after losing a spouse can be financially overwhelming." "Actually, James, I'm managing quite well. Better than my children seem to think anyway." I told him about the birthday surprise, about my children's assumption that I couldn't handle my own financial affairs. "That's unfortunate," he said carefully, "but not entirely uncommon. Adult children often feel they need to step in and protect elderly parents from financial mistakes." "The only mistake I'm concerned about," I said, "is leaving my wealth to people who don't respect me enough to ask my opinion before making major decisions about my life." James set down his pen. "What are you thinking?" "I want to liquidate some assets. Enough to set up the foundation I discussed with Margaret, plus enough to make sure I'm completely independent for the rest of my life." "That's certainly possible. What about your children? Are they aware you're making these changes?" "They will be soon enough." We spent the next hour reviewing my portfolio, identifying which assets to liquidate and which to hold. James estimated that selling about 40% of my holdings would give me enough liquid capital to establish the foundation with $2 million, while still leaving me with passive income of roughly $150,000 per year. "Of course," James noted, "this assumes you're not planning any major expenses, like say extended care in an assisted living facility." "I won't be needing assisted living, James. I'll be staying in my home." "And your children? How do you think they'll react to these changes?" I smiled. "I think they're about to learn that they've severely underestimated their mother." David Walsh arrived at my house the next morning with a briefcase full of market analysis and comparable sales data. He was an energetic man in his 50s who'd been selling real estate in our area for 20 years. "Mrs. Morrison, I have to tell you, this is an incredible property," he said as we walked through the house. "The location, the size, the condition in today's market, you're looking at serious money." "What kind of serious money, David?" He consulted his tablet. "Based on recent sales of similar properties, I'd estimate between $850,000 and $950,000. Maybe more if we get into a bidding war." Nearly $1 million for the house, Harold, and I had bought for $180,000 in 1994. Even accounting for all the improvements we'd made over the years, it was a substantial profit. That's very encouraging, David. Now I have some specific requirements for the sale. Of course. What do you need? First, I want a quick closing, 30 days maximum. That might be challenging, but in this market, cash buyers are common, it's doable. Second, I want to time the listing very carefully. I don't want the house to go on the market until April 2nd. David looked puzzled. Any particular reason for that date? Let's just say I want to coordinate the sale with some other life changes I'm making. All right. Anything else? Yes, I don't want my children to know about the listing until it goes public. This is my decision, and I want to handle it my way. David nodded, though he still looked curious about the timing. Mrs. Morrison, can I ask, your children are supportive of this sale, aren't they? I just want to make sure there won't be any family conflicts that could complicate the process. David, my children have been insisting I sell this house for months. They'll be thrilled. That at least was true. They'd be thrilled about the sale. The timing would be a different matter entirely. The next 10 days passed in a strange state of suspended animation. My children called regularly to check on me and to discuss the logistics of my upcoming move to Sunset Manor. Robert stopped by twice to help me start packing. Each time he'd walk through the house making notes about what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. He was remarkably efficient at cataloging my life's possessions. This furniture is pretty old, Mom, he said, examining the dining room set Harold and I had bought for our first anniversary. I don't think it's worth moving. We should probably donate it. Probably, I agreed. And these photo albums, you won't have room for all of these at Sunset Manor. Maybe we could scan the important ones and put them on that digital frame Susan gave you. That's a thoughtful idea. Susan came by with boxes and packing supplies, cheerfully organizing my closets according to what would be appropriate for institutional living. You really don't need all these fancy dresses anymore, Mom, she said, holding up the black cocktail dress I'd worn to Robert's wedding. Where would you wear something like this at Sunset Manor? Nowhere, I suppose. Jennifer brought me brochures about Sunset Manor's activities program and dining options. She was particularly excited about the fact that all meals were provided. Think of it, Mom, no more grocery shopping, no more meal planning, no more cooking. It'll be like being on vacation permanently. A vacation where I couldn't leave, couldn't choose my food, couldn't control my schedule, and couldn't make any decisions about my own life. Some vacation. Throughout all of this, I maintained the same pleasant, agreeable demeanor I'd shown at my birthday dinner. I asked questions about Sunset Manor, expressed appropriate gratitude for their help with packing, and generally behaved like the compliant elderly mother they expected me to be. But inside, I was counting down the days. April 1st arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for what my children believed would be the end of my independent life. Robert and Susan arrived at 9 a.m. to drive me to the airport. They'd arranged for a moving company to pack up my essential belongings after I left, and they'd handle selling everything else. Are you excited, Mom? Susan asked as she helped me with my suitcase. I know this is a big change, but I really think you're going to love it at Sunset Manor. I'm sure it will be memorable, I said. Robert loaded my luggage into his car while Susan did a final walkthrough of the house, making notes about which items should be donated and which might have resale value. This crystal set might be worth something, she called from the dining room. And that painting in the hallway, wasn't that an anniversary gift from Dad? Yes, I said, your father gave that to me for our 25th anniversary. We should probably get it appraised before we sell it. Wait, as if my possessions had already become community property, the ride to the airport was filled with cheerful chatter about my new adventure. Robert talked about how often they'd visit monthly, if possible. Susan described the activities I'd enjoy: bingo on Wednesdays, crafts on Fridays. Jennifer had packed me a care package with snacks for the flight and magazines to read. They were all being so kind, so thoughtful, so concerned about my welfare. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed they actually cared about my happiness instead of their convenience. At the airport, they walked me to the security checkpoint, took photos of my big departure, and hugged me goodbye with what seemed like genuine emotion. Call us as soon as you get settled, Robert said. We want to hear all about your new room. We love you, Mom, Susan added. This is going to be so good for you. I hugged them back and walked through security, turning to wave one final time. They stood watching until I disappeared around the corner toward the gates, but I didn't board the plane to Sunset Manor. Instead, I walked to the other end of the terminal and took a taxi home. By the time I got back to my house, the moving truck was already there. Through the front window, I could see strangers in coveralls packing up my life's possessions with ruthless efficiency. I paid the taxi driver and walked up to the front door, keys in hand. The head of the moving crew, a burly man in his 40s, looked confused when he saw me. Ma'am, are you Mrs. Morrison? I am. But we were told you'd be gone by now. Your son said you were moving out permanently. There's been a change of plans, I said pleasantly. Please stop packing and put back anything you've already boxed up. Ma'am, I'm going to need to call the person who hired us. This is irregular. Of course, you should call Robert Morrison and explain that I've decided not to move after all. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Mom, what's going on? The moving company called and said you're at the house telling them to stop packing. That's correct, Robert. But you're supposed to be on a plane. You're supposed to be at Sunset Manor by this afternoon. I decided not to go. There was a long pause. Mom, we talked about this. You can't live alone in that house anymore. It's not safe. I'm quite safe, Robert. Safer than I would be in an institution where strangers make all my decisions for me. But the deposit. We put down a $5,000 deposit at Sunset Manor, and your room is ready and the staff is expecting you. I canceled the reservation 2 weeks ago. I told them to refund your deposit. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. This is exactly the kind of confused decision-making that proves you need supervised care. Confused decision-making. There it was again, the assumption that any choice I made that didn't align with their plans must be evidence of mental incompetence. Robert, I need you and Susan to come over this evening. There are some things we need to discuss. What kind of things? Family things, financial things. Be here at 7 p.m. I hung up before he could ask any more questions. At exactly 7 p.m., Robert and Susan arrived at my house. Jennifer came too, probably to provide moral support for the difficult conversation they expected to have with their confused mother. They found me sitting in the living room, dressed in my best suit, with a stack of documents on the coffee table in front of me. Mom, Susan began carefully, we need to talk about what happened today. Canceling your move to Sunset Manor, sending away the moving company, these aren't rational decisions. You're right, I said, we do need to talk, please sit down. They arranged themselves on the sofa across from me, looking like a tribunal preparing to pass judgment on my mental state. Now, I continued, I want to share some information with you that I think you'll find interesting. I picked up the first document from the stack. This is a summary of our family's total assets as of yesterday, prepared by James Peterson. Robert frowned. Mom, you don't need to worry about the financial details. We can handle all of that for you. The total value, I continued as if he hadn't spoken, is $4.7 million. The room went very quiet. That includes 17 rental properties, our stake in Countryside Shopping Center, the stock portfolio, the timberland, the mineral rights, and of course this house. Susan found her voice first. 4.7 million. Yes, your father and I were quite successful investors over the years. Jennifer leaned forward, but Robert said the construction company was the main asset. The construction company is worth about $800,000, I said. A significant sum, certainly, but only about 17% of our total assets. I could see them doing the math, recalculating everything they thought they knew about our family's wealth. Now, I said, picking up another document, this is my will as it stood last week. Robert perked up. This was familiar territory, the will, the inheritance, the orderly transfer of wealth from generation to generation. Under the terms of this will, you two would have inherited everything in equal shares. About $2.35 million each, plus the ongoing income from the rental properties and investments. They were listening very carefully now. However, I continued, picking up a third document, this is my new will, executed yesterday with Margaret Henley. I saw Susan's eyes widen slightly. Margaret Henley was the most respected estate attorney in the county. Whatever I'd done, it was legal and binding. Under the terms of my new will, you, Robert, will inherit exactly $1. Robert stared at me. What? You, Susan, will also inherit exactly $1. Mom, you can't be serious. I am completely serious. The $1 you're each inheriting represents my assessment of how much you value my love, my sacrifice, and my dignity. The room erupted. This is insane, Robert shouted. You can't disinherit your own children. Actually, I can, and I have. Susan was on her feet. Mom, this is exactly what we were worried about. You're not thinking clearly. This proves you need supervised care. On the contrary, I said calmly, this proves I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Jennifer was frantically calculating, but what about the grandchildren? What about their inheritance? I'm glad you asked, I said, picking up another document. Michael, Emma, and Lucy will each receive full educational trusts, college, graduate school, everything they need for their education. But the money goes directly to educational institutions, not to their parents. And the rest of it, Robert demanded, what happens to the rest of the money? The remainder of my estate, approximately $3.8 million, will fund the Alina and Harold Morrison Foundation, dedicated to helping elderly people who are being mistreated by their families. The silence that followed was deafening. What happened next was everything I'd expected and worse. Robert began shouting about legal challenges, about proving mental incompetence, about undue influence. Susan accused me of being vindictive and cruel. Jennifer threatened to prevent me from seeing my grandchildren ever again. "You've lost your mind," Robert raged, "giving away millions of dollars to strangers while your own family gets nothing." "My own family," I said quietly, "decided that I was too incompetent to live in my own home, too senile to manage my own finances, and too much of a burden to deserve basic respect. Why would I leave my money to people who think so little of me?" "We were trying to help you," Susan screamed. "We were trying to protect you. You were trying to control me." "There's a difference. This is about the nursing home, isn't it?" Jennifer accused. "You're angry because we found you a safe place to live. Jennifer, you gave me a one-way ticket to an institution for my 70th birthday. You made plans to sell my house without my permission. You treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected." "Because you are a problem," Robert exploded. "You're stubborn and unreasonable, and you refuse to accept reality about your limitations." "My limitations," I repeated. "You mean my age?" "Yes, you're 70 years old. You shouldn't be living alone in a huge house, trying to manage complex finances, making major decisions without consulting anyone." "Without consulting anyone," I said. "Like the way you made the decision to put me in a nursing home without consulting me." That stopped him cold. "Robert, Susan," I said, standing up, "for the past 2 years you've treated me like a child. You've questioned my every decision, monitored my spending, criticized my choices, and gradually taken control of more and more aspects of my life. You've isolated me from my grandchildren by telling them I'm becoming difficult. You've talked about me as if I weren't in the room, made plans for me as if I had no voice in my own future." I picked up the plane ticket that was still sitting on my side table, the one-way ticket to Sunset Manor that had started this whole confrontation. "This ticket represents everything I've endured from you for the past 2 years. The condescension, the control, the complete lack of respect for my autonomy or my intelligence." I tore the ticket in half. "I am 70 years old, but I am not helpless. I am widowed, but I am not incompetent. I live alone, but I am not isolated. I have friends, interests, activities, and a mind that is every bit as sharp as it was 20 years ago." Susan was crying now. "Mom, we love you. We were just trying to take care of you." "If you love me," I said, "then you'll respect me. You'll ask my opinion before making decisions about my life. You'll treat me like the adult I am instead of the child you seem to think I've become." "And if we do," Robert asked bitterly, "if we apologize and promise to do better, will you change the will back?" I looked at him for a long moment. Even now, even in the face of losing millions of dollars, his concern was for the money, not for our relationship. "Robert, the fact that your first question is about the inheritance tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." That confrontation was 3 months ago. In the time since, my children and I have had very little contact. Robert tried to challenge the will, but Margaret had prepared everything perfectly. The psychological evaluation I'd undergone proved my mental competence beyond any doubt. The witnesses to my will signing included a retired judge and 2 doctors. There was no legal basis for overturning my decisions. Susan has called a few times, ostensibly to check on me, but really to see if I'd reconsidered my position. Each conversation follows the same pattern. She expresses concern for my well-being, hints that she and Robert have learned their lesson, and eventually works around to asking about the will. Jennifer has indeed followed through on her threat to limit my access to my grandchildren. I've seen Michael and Emma exactly once since April, a brief, awkward visit where they seemed confused about why family gatherings had suddenly stopped. But there have been some positive developments too. Lucy, Susan's daughter, has started visiting me on her own. At 16, she can drive herself, and she's old enough to understand that family relationships are complicated. She's the one grandchild who seems to grasp what really happened, who understands that I didn't disinherit her parents out of spite but out of self-respect. "Grandma," she said during one of her visits, "I'm sorry about what happened at your birthday. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to say anything." "You did say something, sweetheart. You asked if I was okay with their plan. That meant more to me than you know. Lucy will be starting college next year, and she's the first to benefit from the educational trust I set up. Unlike her parents, she's never taken my support for granted. I've also reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during Harold's illness and the difficult years that followed. Margaret Henley and I have become close friends, working together on the foundation. James Peterson stops by regularly, not just for business but for genuine friendship. And the house, I never did sell it to David Walsh. I realized that moving out would feel like letting my children win, like admitting they were right about my inability to live independently. Instead, I've made some modifications. I converted the guest bedroom on the first floor into a master suite, so I don't have to navigate stairs daily. I hired a cleaning service not because I can't clean, but because I don't want to. I've joined a book club, started volunteering at the library, and taken up watercolor painting. I'm busier and happier than I've been in years. The Alina and Harold Morrison Foundation officially launched 2 months ago. We've already helped 12 elderly people in situations similar to mine, people whose families were trying to control them, exploit them, or warehouse them in institutions against their will. Our first case was Margaret Simmons, an 83-year-old woman whose son was systematically stealing from her bank accounts while telling everyone she was losing her memory. We helped her hire a forensic accountant, change her banking arrangements, and prosecute her son for theft. Our second case was Robert Chen, a 75-year-old widower whose daughter wanted to sell his house and move him in with her family. Robert didn't want to move, but his daughter had convinced everyone that he couldn't live safely alone. We helped him hire home health aides, install safety equipment, and assert his right to age in place. Each case reminds me why I made the decisions I made. Elder abuse isn't always dramatic. It's not always physical violence or obvious theft. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of autonomy, the gradual assumption of control by people who claim to know what's best for you. Sometimes it's a one-way ticket to a nursing home presented as a birthday gift. Do I regret my decision? Do I wish I'd tried harder to reconcile with Robert and Susan before taking such drastic action? Sometimes, in my loneliest moments, I wonder if there might have been another way. If I'd been more direct about my concerns earlier, if I'd established firmer boundaries from the beginning, might we have avoided this painful estrangement? But then I remember the casual cruelty of that birthday celebration, the assumption that my preferences didn't matter, the complete disregard for my feelings and autonomy. I remember years of condescension, of being treated like a burden rather than a person. And I remember something else, the relief I felt when I finally stood up for myself. For 2 years after Harold's death, I'd been shrinking. Getting smaller, quieter, more compliant with each passing month. I'd been turning into the helpless old woman my children expected me to be. That ends now. I am 70 years old and I am not done living. I am not done making decisions, pursuing interests, forming relationships, or contributing to the world around me. I am not ready to be managed, supervised, or warehoused. And if my own children can't respect that, then strangers who truly need help will benefit from the wealth Harold and I spent a lifetime accumulating. Next month, I'm traveling to Europe, something Harold and I always planned to do but never found time for. I'll spend 3 weeks in Italy, visiting the places we dreamed about during those long nights planning our future. I'm going alone, and I'm excited about it. When I get back, the foundation will expand our services to include legal aid and emergency housing for elderly people escaping family abuse. We're also planning educational programs to help seniors recognize and resist manipulation. Lucy will start college in